Back in the 1960s and 70s, there was a comedian named George Carlin, and one time he said, dusting is a good example of the futility of trying to put things right. As soon as you dust, the fact of your next dusting has already been established. And you know what he means. I mean, if we're going to dust the furniture and commit ourselves to keeping dust off of our furniture, well, better keep that dust rag handy. Because as soon as we wipe it off, more dust starts to fall right away. It seems futile. Dieting and exercising seem futile. Because we know that a day of staying off the diet and not exercising, any weight we lost immediately is going to come rushing back with a vengeance. It seems useless. Unless you're one of those godless people who can eat anything you want and never gain a pound. But just know that you are very hated by some people. I mean that in the most loving way. It's awful. If you have children and grandchildren, you know it seems futile to keep your car clean. To vacuum your car, it just seems like a waste of time. It's futile. Because after you do it, one more trip across town with them, it's going to be back to what it was before. Our middle daughter, Jillian, she has 5 children. And she started leaving her car doors open all night so that raccoons could come in and eat the crumbs off the floor of her car. Shockingly, that created some other problems. So she went back to just giving up. And I said, or you could just feed them before they get in the car or after you get to wherever you're going. Speaking of futility, I now keep my mouth shut about that. But some feel this way about life in general. They think life is just one exercise in futility after another, and there's no real meaning or purpose. Last Sunday, here in the sanctuary, we had the funeral for Harry Williams. And during that message that I had at that funeral, I mentioned an old song from when I was in high school that I really enjoyed. It was by a group named Kansas. It was called Dust in the Wind. It's a beautiful song, but it is about the meaninglessness and futility of life. One of the verses in it says, same old song, just a drop of water in an endless sea. All we do crumbles to the ground, though we refuse to see. Dust in the wind. All we are is dust in the wind. Thankfully, the man who wrote that, his name was Kerry Livgren, and he became a Christian later on. And he said, looking back at that time in my life, that was just how I looked at life. It just seemed empty, meaningless, and futile. And that's where that song came from. Well, today, we are finishing the longest chapter of 1 Corinthians, which is the resurrection chapter, which is chapter 15. And to do that, we need to cover about 30 verses today. And so I won't be reading all of those verses. I'll be reading most of them, but not all. And so some of them I'll be covering in a summary fashion. But I believe overall, the point that Paul was getting at, or the Lord was getting at through Paul, was this: to live an unstoppable, resurrection-driven life. That's what he was getting at in this chapter. And I see that mostly in the last verse of the chapter, because he starts that verse off with the word therefore. In verse 58, he says, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. If we believe it's true that Jesus rose from the dead, this life is anything but futile. And Paul is saying that a life that is driven by the belief in the resurrection will make us steadfast and unstoppable. And I think if any Christian Any Christian who falls away or turns away from the Lord, somewhere along the way, they've lost their passion about the significance of the resurrection of Jesus, and it's become just another ho-hum issue for them in their life. Because if we focus on the resurrection, it will give purpose and meaning to our lives that's unstoppable. But our lives have to be driven by this belief that Jesus rose from the dead. To do that, first of all, pay attention to how people show they believe in life after death. Look at verse 29. Otherwise, what do people mean by being baptized on behalf of the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, why are people baptized on their behalf? Verse 29 is one of those verses in the Bible where we are reminded that in some cases, the writer of the original biblical text and the original audience were cued in on some track and that with each other, and the rest of us who live after the first century have to do a little bit of guesswork. I mean, they knew what the Corinthians knew what Paul was talking about in this. Paul knew that they knew, but we're having to speculate a little bit because of we're not living at that time when he originally wrote it. There are, according to Gordon Fee, a theologian who I utilize quite a bit, even though I have some disagreements with him, of course, but by and large really agree with him. But he said that there are 40 different interpretations of this verse among scholars. He came across 40. We're not going to identify all of them and examine them. I apologize. But the most popular interpretation is that some were being baptized on behalf of family and friends who had never been baptized. And the Latter-day Saints, also referred to as the Mormons, they practice baptism for the dead. And they base this practice solely upon this verse and also a writing, one of their other authoritative writings that they hold to, the Doctrines and Covenants. And they practice baptizing dead relatives. They practice baptism for relatives of theirs or ancestors of theirs who never became Mormon. And so in order to save them, they are baptized on their behalf. And it's based solely on this text. Some say that there were Greek religions at this time who were practicing in their pagan religions some kind of ceremonial washing rites or baptism on behalf of their dead relatives. And it is true that that did go on, but there's no clear-cut evidence that there were groups doing it at the time Paul wrote this, which was in about AD 55. I mean, this verse may indicate that, I think it indicates that was going on. But if this were a Christian practice, we would surely read about it in the book of Acts. If Christians were being baptized on behalf of the dead, we would read about this in the other epistles. But this is the only place in the New Testament where it's even mentioned. And notice that also it's important to note that the early church fathers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, they didn't mention any of this kind of practice going on among Christians. But notice that Paul did not say, why do we baptize for the dead? Or why do some of you baptize on behalf of the dead? All he said here was, what do people mean by being baptized on behalf of the dead? And why are people baptized on their behalf? So there were apparently some who were practicing this, but it wasn't Paul and it wasn't among those in the Corinthian church. Asking about it is not the same as condoning its legitimacy. But Paul's point in asking it was that if there is no resurrection of the dead, why are some of these people who don't believe in the resurrection of the dead bothering to be baptized for their dead relatives. That's all he was saying. And we need to listen to people around us and just listen and observe how people speak about life after death and use that as a springboard to talk to them about Jesus. You know, like when they talk about loved ones who've died and they speak of them being in a better place or in heaven and they're looking forward to seeing them again someday, and you know that they've never given their life to Jesus, that might be a good springboard into asking them, what do you think happens after we die? Where do you think your loved one or your friend is right now? And what makes you confident that you're going to see them? What do you base that on? And just see where the conversation takes you. But some people who say they're not sure Jesus rose from the dead speak about life after death, and we need to pay attention to that and use that to lead them into a discussion about Jesus and where they're going to be after they die. Secondly, let's maintain our motivation in living for Christ. Maintain our motivation in living for Christ. Look at verses 30 through 34. Why are we in danger every hour? I protest, brothers, by my pride in you, which I have in Christ Jesus our Lord. I die every day. What do I gain if, humanly speaking, I fought with beasts at Ephesus? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. Wake up from your drunken stupor, as is right, and do not go on sinning, for some have no knowledge of God, and I say this to your shame. So a question all of us should ask is, when was the last time I suffered or experienced any opposition for my faith in Jesus? And if the answer is no, that we can't think of any time that we've ever suffered for our faith in Jesus, we should ask why. Because Jesus said in Matthew 10:22, you will be hated by everyone because of me. But for that to happen, people have to know we are aligned with Jesus. If we stand for all that Jesus taught, we will be hated by people in this world. He said, woe to you if everyone speaks well of you. In other words, if we are liked by people of the world, something is wrong. Paul said in verse 30, why are we in danger every hour? In verse 31, he said, I die every day. He was meaning, every day I wake up and I know this could be my last day alive on this earth because I have so much opposition for my faith in Jesus. And he was constantly being opposed because he stood against the popular teachings of this world. In verse 32, he said, what do I gain if, humanly speaking, I fought with beasts at Ephesus? I don't believe Paul was saying that he literally fought beasts or animals in Ephesus. In my opinion, I think he was speaking metaphorically about the trouble he faced in Ephesus when he was there. We read about that in Acts chapter 19. There was a riot, and people there wanted to kill him. And so that's what I believe he's saying. And he's saying, if there's no resurrection, why would I live like this? If I didn't really see Jesus, like I said I did, if I'm lying about this, why do you think I'm going through all this? You see, any sacrifice we make for Jesus will pale in comparison to what we know we have after this life. The resurrection of Jesus is the only reason you and I get up every Sunday morning and come here to be with others, because we believe he really did rise from the dead. This is the only reason that we have an urge to get together with other believers to worship while everybody else is going out fishing or playing golf or boating or just staying at home having a nice quiet Sunday morning. We want to be together with other believers to give praise to him because we believe he really did rise from the dead. That's the only reason we give of our money, to support God's kingdom here and across the world. It's the only reason that we would devote ourselves to studying this amazing book because we believe it's true. That's the only reason we should be teaching our kids to be willing to go against the flow of our modern culture and on all morality and values. Paul went on to say that if the dead are not raised, it makes more sense to just go ahead and eat and drink all you can for tomorrow we die. So just get all the pleasure out of life that you can. In verse 33, he said that he urged them to avoid keeping too close of contacts with people of the world, and because they will stimulate us into living in a way that's not pleasing to the Lord. In verse 33, he said, bad company ruins good morals. That is a verse. I quoted that verse more than any other verse to my children when they were teenagers. That is, I constantly reminded them of that. Bad company corrupts good character or ruins good morals. Verse 34 is where he warned them not to fall into that way of thinking and to wake up. And he said, don't go on sinning like people in the world do. One of the biggest mistakes Christians make is enjoining ourselves too closely to people outside of the faith. Because all too often, they end up influencing us more than we're influencing them if we're staying too close to them. Now, we have to keep some connection with them in order to be good witnesses to them. But we can't get so close that they end up dragging us away from our commitment to Jesus. So, living an unstoppable, resurrection-driven life means to maintain our motivation in living for Jesus. Thirdly, we should look forward to our new bodies. In verses 35 to 49, the body is the focus of these verses. And I know that because in those verses, 35 to 49, the word body or bodies is mentioned 10 times. And it wasn't mentioned once in verses 1 to 34. But Paul was making the case that we can live an unstoppable, resurrection-driven life because we have new bodies to look forward to after the return of Jesus. Look at verse 35, where Paul brought up a hypothetical conversation that might have with someone. He says, but someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body did they come? In verse 36, he said, just tell them they're fools. In verses 36 to 41, Paul used illustrations from horticulture and biology and cosmology. And his point in doing this comparison and contrast was to demonstrate that God has created all kinds of different life in different body forms. So not to put God in a box and think that God is incapable of giving us new glorified bodies after Jesus returns. That he is able to do something amazing with our bodies. And he was saying things like, think about it. How does an ugly little acorn become an enormous and beautiful oak tree? From that little acorn, buried in the ground, essentially dying, God is able to bring up this beautiful oak tree from something so small. And he's saying that God will use our bodies like a seed, and he will give us a new kind of body. So verse 42 says, so is it with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, but what is raised is imperishable. Sown in dishonor, raised in glory. Sown in weakness, raised in power. New bodies. I may have six-pack abs in eternity and a full head of hair. Ladies, you won't need makeup. Not that any of you do, but you know, some people just feel that let's move on. Verses 44 to 50. This Paul contrasted our current bodies with our future body by calling these bodies natural bodies and our future bodies spiritual body. That we will not be just disembodied spirits in eternity. Now, this side of Jesus' return, when we die, our spirits do go to be with the Lord, and we're not given resurrection bodies immediately when we die. I believe that happens after Jesus comes back. But we do go to be with the Lord. Our spirits are with him. But it speaks about these new bodies coming after his return. So when people say things like, I know grandma is up there doing yard work or cooking, and grandpa's out fishing or golfing right now, and they're all eating ice cream in heaven. I know that's going on. Those things aren't true yet. First of all, if they're in paradise with the Lord, they're there because they believed, put their trust and their faith in Jesus. But secondly, they couldn't be doing those things because the Bible doesn't speak of them receiving those bodies until after Jesus comes back. And when he comes back, we will receive new spiritual bodies according to what Paul says here. They're spiritual bodies, so they're made up of some kind of physicality, new physicality that will be like Jesus' resurrected body. In verses 45 to 49, he used the example of Adam and Christ and contrasted. He said Adam was from dust and Jesus was from heaven. And he said Adam was from dust, that's what our current bodies are made of. That we are created in the image of God, yes, but Adam's sin marred that image. And he said in verse 48, as was the man of dust, so also are those who are of dust. That's us. Verse 49 is an amazing verse. He says, just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man from heaven. We had the image of Adam, but now we have the image of Christ in us, and it will be perfected after he returns. Philippians 3:21 says that at Jesus' return, it says, he will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body. And if we can draw any conclusions about these bodies by looking at Jesus' body after he rose from the dead, it would mean some things. That, one is that it will be in adult form. We'll be able to eat, praise the Lord, because ate. We'll be able to go from one place to another immediately. We'll be able to pass through walls. That'd be kind of cool. And then also, we'll be recognizable, but like with the men on the road to Emmaus, we'll be able to maybe change our appearance. We want to fool somebody or for some reason. But we're going to be recognizable, but radically different. So in the times of the new heavens and new earth, we'll be able to, I think, maybe do all those things. But it is, in my opinion, after the return of Jesus when we're given the bodies to go with our spirits that are with him when we die. Lastly, we should be able to live an unstoppable resurrection-driven life because we can laugh in the face of death. J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, said, taunting death means pitting oneself against a wily enemy who cannot lose. And normally, we would agree with that and say we have to be careful about taunting or mocking, because sometimes when you taunt, it comes back to haunt us. A taunt will haunt the taunter. In sports, players will often taunt somebody from the opposing team. And in the NFL season before this last one, in the fall of 2023, Josh Allen, the quarterback of the Buffalo Bills, was about to go into the end zone, and just before he went into the end zone, he turned and pointed in the face of a Cincinnati Bengals defensive back. That's called taunting. And he received a 15-yard penalty, so the touchdown was wiped out. He also got fined $11,000, which is probably meaningless to him, but he probably was more bothered by the no touchdown thing. But if we're going to taunt, we better be able to back it up. And typically, Christians should never be people to taunt or mock or ridicule. And that's why I think we need to be careful about what we post on social media and our witness on there. But there's one situation where Christians have complete permission to taunt. And that is, we have permission to taunt and mock and ridicule death. That's exactly what we read that Paul did as he brought this chapter to a close. Look at verses 51 to 53. Paul said, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality." Have you ever read or listened to some of the things people say about death? Someone said, "I don't really fear dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens." Paul mocks death in these verses. In verse 51, he said, "We will all be changed." That's a popular verse on the walls of many church nurseries. But it is, they put it in there. But in verse 52, he said, "We will be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. At the last trumpet will sound, and we will be changed just like that." In fact, it'll be faster than just like that. He says, in the twinkling of an eye. John MacArthur said that the twinkling of an eye is even faster than a blink. It's talking about the time that it takes for a flash of light to go through the iris and reach the retina. One writer said that the word for twinkling is 1/6 of a nanosecond. So a microsecond is a millionth of a second. And a nanosecond is 1/1000th of the microsecond. So a nanosecond is 1/1000th of a millionth of a second. And the twinkling is 1/6 of a 1,000th of a millionth of a second. That's fast. And that's how fast we're going to be changed into these glorious bodies. And that's why we can mock death. Now let's really read where Paul really taunted and mocked death in verses 54 to 57. "When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." Isn't this rich? He said in verse 55, "O death, where is your victory?" And then it's like he says, "I'll tell you where it is. It was given to us. Thanks be to God who gives us the victory." So God took the victory that death always had, and he gave the victory to us. Death always had the upper hand, not anymore for those who are in Christ. Years ago, Tony Campolo told about a funeral he went to in Philadelphia. And he said he's Italian, but he belongs to an African-American church there in Philadelphia. And he said he went to that church, he said, because our African-American brothers and sisters take heaven seriously. And he said, and I needed that in a church. And Tony went for his first funeral that he'd ever gone to at a church at age 19 in this church. A friend of his named Clarence, who was from that church, had died in a train accident. And the community was devastated. The place was packed. And Tony was a pallbearer for the funeral, so for his friend Clarence. So he said he had a front row seat. And he said the pastor of this church was amazing. He said from the pulpit, he talked about the resurrection in such beautiful terms and with power and confidence. It just lifted the hearts of everybody who was there. He said that he had the people thrilled. Tony said that the pastor went on for 20 minutes describing life after death and Tony said this. He said, he made heaven sound so wonderful that halfway through his sermon I was wishing I was dead. Then he said, the pastor came down from the pulpit to the floor, and he went to the family and he comforted them with the words of Jesus from John chapter 14, where Jesus said, let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. And the pastor said, Clarence has gone to heavenly mansions. Then the preacher went over to the casket. The lid was still open because in this church, they didn't close the lid of the casket until the end of the funeral. And so for the last 20 minutes, the pastor, he actually preached to the open casket. Now that's dramatic. And Tony said that he yelled at the corpse. He said, Clarence! Clarence! And he said it with such authority, nobody would have been shocked if Clarence would have responded. He said, Clarence, you were a good boy, and we loved you. Maybe we didn't tell you that often enough when you were here, but we're going to say it now. We love you, Clarence, and we thank you. We thank you for how good you were to your old grandma, and how respectful you were to your mother, and how kind you were to your little brothers and sisters. There were a lot of things we should have said, Clarence, and we didn't say them, because you got away too fast, Clarence. So we have to thank you now. Tony said that if that wasn't enough, the preacher went on for a really dramatic moment for the finish. He to the casket and he looked down into Clarence's face and said, well, Clarence, there ain't nothing more to say. And when there's nothing more to say, there's only one thing to say. And that's good night, Clarence. And so he reached his hand up on the lid and said, good night, Clarence, and he slammed it shut. And then one more time he said, good night, Clarence. Then the preacher slowly turned around, Tony said, and you could see this little smile on his face. And he said that he went on a little bit more and said, yes, I said good night, Clarence, and that's sad because we won't see his face anymore. But I can say that this with hope and even joy. He said, because I know that God is going to give Clarence a good morning. We say good night, Clarence, but God is right now saying, wake up, Clarence. Good morning, Clarence. You're home. And just then the choir stood and started singing in that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. You see, that is the joy of the Lord, a joy that can laugh and sing and mock in the face of death because death's stinger has been removed by what Jesus did. And the fact that this is true and really happened is why we can live an unstoppable resurrection-driven life. Would you stand, please? If you don't have that confidence, we would like for you not to leave this morning without having it. And we offer this time of invitation. Come forward and say, I want that confidence to be able to laugh in death's face and to have a resurrection-driven life. If you haven't done that, we give you this opportunity now. If you've already done that, but you've turned away, as you know, we offer time for Christians to rededicate themselves, recommit themselves to Jesus. And this is a good time to do that. Or if you're in need of prayer for something, we would invite you to come as well. Whatever's on your heart, we invite you to come as we sing.